In part 2 of the video, we're going to actually use the formulas we previously discussed on the predetermined overhead rate in order to apply overhead to our jobs. So the first thing we need to do is use our cost formula, y equals F plus Vx, as I like to call it, in order to figure out what our estimated overhead cost is going to be. So in this case, it says peer company estimates it's going to require 160,000 direct labor hours to meet estimated production. In addition, the company estimates fixed overhead is 200,000 and variable is 275 per direct labor hour. So to use our formula, y equals F plus Vx, we're going to start with our fixed cost, which is 200,000, and then add our variable cost per unit of 275 times the estimated activity, which is 160,000 direct labor hours. And then when we do out the math on that, we're going to end up getting 640,000 as our estimated overhead cost. The next step is going to be to put that into our formula for the predetermined overhead rate, which is our POHR equals our estimated overhead over our estimated activity. So our total estimated overhead is going to be 640,000, and then our estimated activity is the 160,000 direct labor hours. So when we do out our math, that's going to give us a predetermined overhead rate equal to $4 per direct labor hour. So how do we use that? Well, as a job incurs direct labor hours, for each labor hour the job uses, we're going to apply $4 in overhead to the job. So when we apply overhead, effectively what we do is we take our predetermined overhead rate times our actual level of activity. And to remember this, I remember applied is based on actual activity, AA. So applied is based on the actual level of activity. So applying the overhead to the jobs requires that we take that estimated predetermined overhead rate that we calculated at the beginning of the year, which is the $4, and then we multiply it by the actual activity, whatever the driver is. Well, we've already determined that the driver for this is direct labor hours, so we're going to take the 8 direct labor hours, carry it over, and then multiply that by our predetermined overhead rate of 4. And that's where our 32 comes from, which is the last component of our product cost. So now that we have the 3 components of our product cost included in our job, we're now going to use that information to calculate the total cost of the job and the unit product cost. So to get the total product cost, it's very easy. You just take your materials, labor, and the overhead applied, and that's your total cost. So the total cost of this job was $268. It says the units completed were 2, so in order to figure out what our product cost is on a unit basis, I hope you can imagine, all you do is take your total cost divided by the units. So that's where we get the 134. It's 268 divided by 2. It's the total cost divided by the total units. And that gets us our cost per unit. That's very useful information for managers to have because they're going to utilize that to determine how much they should be charging their customers. Obviously, they need to charge more than $134 per unit in order to cover all of the costs and then leave some room to cover selling and administrative costs as well as profit. So let's take a moment and do an example. So again, as a reminder, you should be using the student version of the PowerPoint, so you'll have the opportunity to come up with these answers on your own. I give you the instructor version as well, just so you have comprehensive notes if you need them. But we should be using the student version as we go through the various PowerPoints, which will allow you to take effective notes. So job WR53 at NW Fab Inc. required 200 direct materials, 10 direct labor hours at $15 an hour. Estimated overhead was $760. Estimated direct labor hours were $20. What's the recorded cost of the job? So pause the video now and give it a try, and then we'll come back and see if you come to the same conclusions that I do. All right, welcome back. So remember, our job cost is made up of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Let's start with the easy ones, which are the ones that are directly traceable, the materials and the labor. So our direct materials is 200. How do I know that? Because it's said in the problem. Direct labor would be 10 hours times $15 an hour. So that, with my limited math skills, I believe comes out to 150. And then overhead's a little tricky. The first step is we're going to have to get our predetermined overhead rate. Our predetermined overhead rate is equal to the estimated overhead over the estimated activity. So for this problem, it told us the estimated overhead was 760 and the estimated activity was 20,000 direct labor hours. So if we do out the math, we'll get our overhead rate per direct labor hour. So 760,000 divided by 20,000 gives us a rate of $38 per direct labor hour. So then to apply overhead, we're going to take the 10 direct labor hours that were worked, and we're going to multiply it by the predetermined overhead rate, which is 38 an hour. So that's going to give us 380. So then in order to figure out the total job cost, we have to include all three: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. So 380 plus 150 plus 200 gives us 730. It's really important on multiple choice problems to read the question carefully, because it says here what would be recorded as the cost of job WR53. So it's asking for the total job cost. Some students might jump the gun and get the manufacturing overhead, see the 380 and get excited and pick it and pat themselves on the back thinking that they're right, but you're not. That's what I call a drug dealer answer. It matches one of the answers you get along the way in your calculation. So does this 200 for the materials. If you add the 200 and the 150, you get the 350. So all these numbers are here to trip you up. You need to answer the question being asked. And because this question is asking you for the total job cost, you need all three elements added together, which makes D the answer. So you don't want the drug dealer answers. Say no to drugs. It's a good life lesson for you, and it'll help you on our exams and quizzes. So moving on, we'll see if I'm right. Let's hope. D indeed is the right answer, and then there's a typed version of the answers provided. Looks a lot like what I calculated already for us. If we inaccurately assign manufacturing costs, ultimately that means that the data that we're using to make decisions is going to be incorrect, and then managers are going to come up with poor decisions as a result. Job order costing systems can accurately trace direct materials and direct labor costs of the jobs, but we have to allocate the overhead. So if we fail to accurately allocate overhead costs during the production process, we're going to end up making inappropriate decisions because we won't have the true cost of the job available to managers for them to use in decision making. How do we choose an allocation base? Well, for our purposes in this class, the allocation base will be provided to you, but in the real world, we need to come up with an allocation base that's really the driver for the overhead costs. In other words, what driver actually makes most of the overhead costs happen. The better the relationship is between the driver and the overhead costs, the better our allocation of overhead will be. Many companies, for simplicity, use a plant-wide overhead rate, which is one size fits all. And if you're like me, you know that one size fits all doesn't always fit. My wife tells me I have an abnormally large head. I don't think so, but she might be right because those one-size-fits-all hats are a little snug on me. So the bottom line is it's sometimes overly simplistic. It's nice to do one-size-fits-all, but a lot of times in order to get more accurate information, using multiple predetermined overhead rates can actually be a better solution. No worries. Doing multiple predetermined overhead rates isn't much more difficult than a single rate. Instead of getting one predetermined overhead rate by dividing the estimated overhead over the estimated activity, you're going to do it multiple times. Again, the overhead will be provided, the drivers will be provided. You just got to do a little more math. It's not that hard. You can do it.